Thank you. I hope you all slept well. I seem to have developed this slight throat thing that Will had yesterday, so excuse me if I'm also straining a bit. For those that don't know me, I'm Kerry Albright. I am the Principal Advisor, Deputy Director of Evaluation at UNICEF. I also am co-chair of the Children and Young Persons Wellbeing Campbell Coordinating Group with that hat on. But here today, I'm talking to you as an institutional co-chair of this new initiative called the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition. It's my great pleasure to be here today. I hope you find this of interest. I'm not sure whether I don't think she's here yet. My UNDP co-chair, Isabel, she has a home here and she's finding that she gets stuck in traffic. So she may well be a few minutes late, but I'll introduce her when she comes in. So let me introduce our panelists here this morning. So first of all, to my left is Shivit Bakrania, who's an evaluation specialist with the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP. He's also the lead methodologist, synthesis methodologist for the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition. And he's the co-chair. There's going to be a lot of acronyms here this morning, so let me warn you, he's the co-chair of the UNEG, which is the United Nations Evaluation Group Evidence Synthesis Group. And he formally helped establish the evidence synthesis function at UNICEF's Office of Research in Achenti. And he's going to be talking a little bit, giving an overview of the coalition, talking a little bit about the purpose, the current status, and maybe some of the asks of this audience. Next to him, a familiar face, I'm sure to many of you, Dr. Birte Snilstveit, who's the Director of Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE, as well as head of the London office, where she's been leading development of the methodology for evidence gap maps and also the web platform for evidence gap maps, including the development evidence portal. She also has a Campbell hat, the editor of the Campbell International Development Coordinating Group. And she's going to talk a little bit about some of the work that 3IE were involved in the early days of scoping the coalition, thinking about the evidence base for where we stand on the SDGs, etc. Next to her is Deborah McWhinney, who's a senior evaluation advisor and lead of the meta-synthesis team at the United Nations Population Fund, or UNFPA. She's also the vice chair of the United Nations Evaluation Group, UNEG. She was a member of the management group for the first coalition synthesis product that we produced on partnerships. And alongside Shiv, she's also the co-chair of the UNEG Evidence Synthesis Group. So she's going to talk a little bit about what UNEG is, the evaluation functions across the UN, and as well as some of the methodological challenges that we've been experiencing so far that you may have heard Thomas de Hoop mention in a presentation yesterday as well. And then finally, but certainly not least, is Dr. Daniel Ortega, who's the Director of Impact Assessment at the Development Bank of Latin America, or CAF. He is known to many of you through his work on impact evaluation as a tool for public management. He was also involved in the management group of the first synthesis product on partnerships. But in this room, again, he is probably also best known to you as a member of the Campbell board. So Daniel is going to talk about the coalition from a user perspective, both why we think this work is an important public good, why we think it's maybe a slightly different from a traditional synthesis product, perhaps, and the work of some of the coalition to date. And there are also people around the room. Ross, any others who are here who are involved or have been involved in the coalition, maybe put up your hands. Tina, so we can see around the room. And there's some others who are shy, who are, I know, on various members of management groups and technical advisory panels. But before I hand over to Shiv, just to say this was really, it came about, it was a UNDP idea, recognizing that perhaps evaluative evidence had been missing in the debate about SDGs. It was all hidden or buried, but also that we needed to do something to really identify what works, why, and how, but to think about where we could identify accelerators. So Shiv, hand it over to you to talk about that in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. We seem to have skipped ahead a few slides already. You're in a rush?
No.
Okay. So yeah, thanks. So I'm going to talk about the coalition, what it is, why we need it, what we're doing, who's involved, and how you can all support as the broader evidence synthesis community. So why is there a need for the coalition? We're halfway towards the 2030, the stated end date of the SDGs, and we're far off track. The Global Sustainable Development Report 2023 actually says that based on current trends, the world will not achieve any of the SDGs even by 2050, so 20 years off track. But it also says that it's possible to improve future prospects. And it really emphasizes the role of science and evidence in doing this. And I just wanted to say at the same time, a couple of years ago, the UN Secretary General made a call for all the UN evaluation offices and agencies to work together to collate the huge evaluative evidence base that we have and make sense of it. So this is what the coalition is trying to do. So what is our mission? Simply put, we're trying to harness the power of evaluation and synthesis to accelerate the achievement of the 2030 agenda. And Birte is going to talk a little bit after about the scope of evidence available on SDGs. But just a couple of things here. UNDP alone has over 6,000 evaluations. And across the UN, in the United Nations Evaluation Group database, we have 25,000 evaluations that are there on the database. So we have this superpower that I think we can really make good use of and use it for decision making on the SDGs. So who's involved? So as Kerry said, it's co-led by the evaluation offices of UNDP and UNICEF, but we also have 45 other UN entities involved in different ways and at different levels. There's a number of member states who are contributing and part of the partnership. And we also count different evaluation and synthesis networks of partners, including Campbell. What you see on the screen there is just a few of the partners. I couldn't include all of the logos of all the different partners, but you see the UN agencies there who are co-leads of the various pillars in the coalition. So how are we approaching this? And fundamental to how we're doing this at the moment is this pillar approach. So you can see that on screen that the 17 SDGs are organized into 5 pillars. We have the partnership, the planet, the peace, the people, and the prosperity pillar. And the pillars make us think about, make us think beyond the individual SDGs and the interlinkages between them. It makes us think about how sustainable development is multidimensional. It also encourages us to think about the fact that progress in one area could be an accelerator for progress in another area. And conversely, how progress in one area could actually lead to some detrimental effects downstream in another area. So it makes us think across the SDGs. And, this pillar structure allows different entities with their different mandates to coalesce around areas of their own interest. And in some ways, each pillar is a mini coalition in and of itself. Another aspect of how we're doing this is the governance structure of the coalition. So, we're operating in the UN system, so obviously we have a really complicated governance structure, but it does mean we have input and decision-making at different political levels. So right at the top there, we have this steering committee, which is a high-level political steering committee. It has a ministerial or equivalent representation from different member states. And let's see if I can remember who's on there. So we have Lithuania, Denmark, UK, Spain, the Philippines, Nigeria, Panama and Malawi, yeah. And then for each pillar, we have a management group and a technical advisory panel. So the management group, as it kind of suggests, responsible for the management of each pillar synthesis, responsible for the kind of quality assurance and making sure that it kind of gets through. The majority of them are co-led by different UN agencies, but not all of them. So for example, Daniel from CAF is a co-lead of the prosperity pillar. And we have the technical advisory panels where they're comprised of different academic, practitioners, policymaker, experts who give their technical and subject matter expertise and input into the different syntheses. And then methodologically, how are we approaching these syntheses? So yesterday, we had a session on the coalition's first synthesis, which was on the partnership pillar. And Thomas de Hoop described, and his team described how they drew on 4 different evidence sources, okay? So the partnership pillar drew on impact evaluations and systematic reviews to answer questions of effectiveness. This was synthesized using a narrative synthesis approach and meta-analysis for certain interventions around certain clusters of studies. They also included performance and process evaluations. So these help answer the how and why questions. These are evaluations produced by UN agencies and other multi and bilateral development agencies. They're qualitative in nature, so we take a qualitative synthesis approach. And the partnership pillar synthesis also included voluntary national reviews as an evidence source. And within the UN system, these are an important way for member states to self-report on their progress towards the SDGs. So from these reviews, we can draw out thematic data on progress and sentiment. And they also looked at SDG tracker data as part of a positive deviance analysis to identify outliers in terms of countries who had made good progress towards SDG 17. So going forward, we think we're going to use this model. We're not quite sure if we'll continue with data from voluntary national reviews and the positive deviance analysis for future syntheses. But they will be mixed method reviews drawing on kind of external impact evaluations external to the UN and this internal evidence base that we have in the form of process and performance evaluations. So just to give a sense of the timeline of the coalition. So the story goes back to COVID, pandemic era. UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office was finding it difficult to travel, to undertake evaluations, to do missions in the field. And synthesis at that time was seen as a productive and constructive way of doing something in that period. So then the idea of synthesizing evidence on the SDGs came about. You could probably say that in 2022 is when it really started. So actually 3IE developed a consent note and did an initial scoping, and Birte will speak a bit about that after me. And we began work on commissioning the first synthesis on the partnership pillar. I think that was around May 2022. So to the current year, 2023, we developed this high-level steering committee. We had the first meeting. The partnership pillar was done and finalized, and it was launched a few weeks ago in September at the UN SDG Summit. And we began work on the other pillar syntheses as well. Next year, the initial ambition for next year was to have all 5 pillar syntheses done for the Summit of the Future, the UN Summit of the Future, which takes place in September 2024. And that's seen as an important sort of milestone for member states to make further commitments for towards the SDGs. So I think, having done the first one and looking where we are, that's a very ambitious task and probably impossible, actually, to get all of those done. But we want to get as far as we can, and we'll see how we do this year. We've also started thinking about how we can best communicate and translate lessons and findings from these syntheses. And we've started thinking about the idea of an evidence portal that doesn't necessarily mean an all-encompassing megalomaniac evidence portal of our own. It might mean working with other existing evidence portals to see how best we can communicate lessons and findings from the synthesis. So moving a bit forward to 2025, we hope we'll have all the synthesis completed, and we'll continue work on the communication and advocacy of lessons from those syntheses. Moving even forward to 2027, in the spirit of living syntheses, this might be an opportune moment to update what we've done and it'll be 3 years ahead of the 2030 deadline. So it's an opportune moment also to feed in findings and lessons from these syntheses into decisions on what may come after the SDGs. And then 2030, this pipe dream of having an established evidence architecture on the SDGs to really feed that rigorous evidence from synthesis into decisions on what comes after. Okay, so why should we be doing this now? So I've been having conversations with some of you over the past few days, and many of you said that you understand the importance of doing this now. If we leave this another year or two, we'll miss the boat. Okay, it's really important to do this now and start feeding this evidence into decision making on the SDGs. And I think I see a lot of alignment in objectives. I think many of us in the synthesis community have wanted something like this for a long time. Campbell, the new strategic plan of Campbell is actually focused around the SDGs. But I also see within the UN system different opportunities arising. So just a couple of examples here. I spoke about the Global Sustainable Development Report, which was launched in September at the UN SDG Summit. And that report reaffirms the use of science and evidence for decision-making on the SDGs. It talks about identifying pathways, it talks about identifying roadblocks, and it talks about holding governments to account through assessing the impacts of their policies, okay? So that's really important. And then apart from that, for example, in July at the UN's high-level political forum, we had our first Science Day. So that was organized by UNDP in collaboration with the International Science Council and a few others. And the International Science Council released a report calling for a global evidence architecture on the SDGs. So I think there's a lot of alignment and a lot of emphasis on the use of evidence for decision making. And I think, we need to jump onto that opportunity right now. Okay, but this is really challenging, right? It's really ambitious, complex, and challenging. And at the Secretariat, the past 9 months have been crazy. It's been a real whirlwind. Most of the time over the past year has been taken up by coordination. We have a lot of partners. We have 45 UN entities involved. And most of the time is about coordinating and managing that partnership. And we can't really, we haven't got as close to the content as we would have liked to. We haven't been able to take a step back and think strategically about the coalition. And then secondly is the sheer scope of this work. So the partnership pillar was an achievement in itself, but some of these pillars include 5 SDGs, the planet, the people, the prosperity pillar. So the scope of the evidence base is almost infinite. How do we even start kind of approaching that? So related to that, we need to make decisions on each pillar. We might not be able to cover everything. We need to think about what we focus on. And that may involve hard decisions on what's in and what's out for each pillar. And then moving forward a bit, we're doing this within the UN system. We have certain political and operational imperatives. We need to meet certain policy deadlines, things like the SDG Summit, the Summit of the Future. And that ultimately means that there's stress on the timelines for the synthesis. The partnership synthesis was done in 9 months, right? So we're talking about fairly quick timelines here. And then finally, this thing costs a lot of money. We're nowhere near having the amount of money or the budget that we need to undertake this work. But there are opportunities. So I do think the development of the coalition in itself is an achievement. 45 different UN agencies, other partners, all focusing on synthesis. I've really seen a step change in the UN system on the kind of recognition on the value and utility of synthesis. And I think that's really encouraging for us as a broader synthesis community. And then as UN agencies, we have mandates, we have influence, we have reach into different levels of political decision-making. And I think it's useful for us to take advantage of that. And then the reason I think I really wanted to get involved in this initiative is I saw the coalition as a platform for achieving this thing that I think that many of us have been talking about for several years, about this evidence architecture framed around the SDGs. And I think this could be a platform for pushing on that. So I'm going to end with a call out for support. We need the support of the broader evidence synthesis community. Thus far, I think we've been talking as a coalition internally a lot within the UN system. And I was really excited to come to the summit here to talk externally to colleagues here. So how can you help? Well, if anyone has deep pockets here or knows anybody else who does, come and speak to us. Help us fund this thing. We need methodological and technical support. These syntheses individually are really complex. You know, they're very broad in scope and, you know, almost unprecedented in scope maybe. So we need that kind of methodological support to ensure that we're taking on board the latest thinking in terms of both quantitative and qualitative synthesis. Help us undertake the syntheses or parts of them. Help us support the conceptualization and development of this evidence portal to ensure that we can communicate, you know, findings and lessons from the syntheses. And like I said, that's not about us developing something new and all-encompassing. It may be about working with existing evidence portals. And then finally, as a broader partnership, we need help to communicate, translate the findings and lessons from the synthesis and use them for advocacy. And I'll hand back to Kerry. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Shiv. So if it's okay with you, I'll hold questions until all of our presenters have spoken. So without further ado, Birte, please come and tell us about the background.
Right, good morning, everyone. And Shiv, no one can accuse you of not being ambitious. So the opportunity in front of us is both daunting and inspiring. As the global community is taking stock of SDG progress, we have a unique opportunity to ensure that those that are tasked with designing programs that are aiming to course correct to help us achieve the SDGs have access to high quality evidence synthesis. So as mentioned, I'm going to share some of the results of some scoping work that we did with UNDP back in 2022, as well as some ongoing work with Deborah to develop a state of the SDG evidence report. But the main takeaway is that there is a large body of evidence ready for us to learn from. So when the opportunity to work with UNDP to map out the existing evidence came up, this felt like the opportunity that we had been waiting for. At 3IA, we've hosted a database or evidence portal in different forms since 2010. In 2018, we received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to upgrade it, including by extracting data on the SDGs. And also on interventions, outcomes, and the extent to which impact evaluations address equity. So having the opportunity to draw on this existing data felt really exciting. So this is just to give you a sense of the evidence base that's out there. So obviously, so we drew on the data that we already had available on the DEP. So at the time, we had data on over 10,000 impact evaluations and almost 1,000 systematic reviews. We identified 10,000 evaluations from within the UN system, but the analysis that you see here is based on around 3,000 so this scoping was conducted over a couple of months. So we didn't have more data, but I think hearing from Shiv, there has already been progress in further mapping that out. And so you know, what you see is that there is a lot of evidence out there. There is variation across the pillars. So as you might expect, the people pillar is the area where we see the largest evidence base, but that's also to be expected because it covers poverty and hunger, education, health, areas where we know that there is a lot of impact evaluation evidence. This is followed by prosperity, where there are clusters of evidence on SDGs 8 and 10 in particular. And you know, I think a concerning finding from the mapping so far is the relative limited evidence base on the planet pillar. And so looking at the evidence in a bit more detail by SDG. And so here we are in the first figure to your left. We're plotting the number of impact evaluations and the number of systematic reviews according to the different SDGs. And so here you also see that there is huge variation. So for SDG 1, the evidence base is overwhelming. And there's also a number of other goals where there are more than 1,000 impact evaluations. And so for anyone who is familiar with doing evidence synthesis, handling 1,000 studies, and that is just talking about the impact evaluation evidence base. I think as Shiv highlighted, the approach that's being proposed is also, and it's really important to also synthesize the qualitative evidence and process evaluations. But then there are other areas like life below water, where we see a very limited evidence base. We've done some analysis recently, updating the data with new studies, looking at the trends. And quite interestingly, we see a change in the pattern. So the people pillar, which has sort of been the one that has been the largest and growing most quickly, is slowing down with a surge in studies becoming available on prosperity and planet. We don't know yet why this is, but we're thinking that it might be related to COVID and you know, the ability, for example, within the planet pillar to do more evaluations based on existing data. So Shiv talked about the challenge of doing the synthesis at the pillar level, and just, you know, the huge task that it would be to, for example, tackle the people pillar. So this is just showing an example very quickly put together using the data on the DEP and creating a very rough, rapid evidence gap map, drawing on, so we've developed a taxonomy of interventions and outcomes, very imperfect, but so mapping the studies then on the SDG 15 on life on land. And so what we're seeing is, well, in this, for those of you who are not familiar with evidence gap maps, the gray bubbles are impact evaluations and the colored bubbles are systematic reviews. And in particular, the important ones are the green bubbles, because those are high quality systematic reviews. And so what we're seeing by plotting it in this way is, for this goal in particular, we see that there is a lack of high quality, up-to-date evidence synthesis. And so it's possible to look at each of the SDGs in this way to try and identify areas where there are impact evaluations, but there are no existing high quality, up-to-date systematic reviews. And that brings me to another point, which is a challenge in terms of relying on the existing systematic review evidence base. And I think an area where this community has a key role to play is to ensure that when systematic reviews are done, they're done to a high standard. So we're actually finding that when we critically appraise existing systematic reviews, a large share of them have major limitations in the way that they are conducted. So I have mentioned the development evidence portal, and I thought that I would just take the opportunity to say a few more words about what it is and encourage you to visit this. It's a unique resource that can aid this project. It's continuously updated with new studies. So we're focusing our searches on across the health and social and economic sectors, focusing on low and middle income countries. And we're coding data across 100 variables, including SDGs, interventions, country study designs. And so it allows users to filter the studies by these variables. So for a number of years, our North Star has been to draw on and further develop the DEP, to provide an evidence infrastructure that is supporting evidence-informed decision-making in global development. And what I've shown you some of already is that there is a lot. What the data in the DEP shows us is that there is a lot that we can learn. And the SDG Synthesis Coalition and the ambition and vision of this project highlights the importance of having these curated evidence bases. As Shiv mentioned, finance is an issue, while the annual running costs of the development evidence portal is not much more than the cost of one trial. And similarly, I think that Shiv was talking about the amount of money that's required for the ambition of the coalition. When, yes, it's a lot of money, but it's probably the equivalent of a handful of trials. So I would just encourage you all to do what you can to support this effort and make sure that we learn as much as we can from the existing evidence. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Birte. And Deb, over to you to talk about where we are to date and some of the methodological challenges we've been coming across.
Thank you very much, Kerry. In fact, because I'm new to this community, I felt I wanted to take inspiration a bit from the storytelling of yesterday and just briefly first express appreciation for the conference itself and actually for the work being done in this evidence synthesis community. It's really very inspiring and really quite impressive. And I say that coming from someone who has a background in humanitarian and development work in countries in the field. I've spent most of my career in the field doing program work and then getting into evaluation and then into evaluation synthesis. So the working group that we co-chair, Shiv and I, is evaluation synthesis, not evidence synthesis. So we're making, no, but I say that as a segue because this is where the Kerry and Shiv have for the last couple of years within the UN evaluation group context been questioning what we're doing. Why are you sampling? Why are you, developing your inclusion and exclusion criteria in this way? How are you thinking about your universe and what are the protocols you're using and why are you developing? How are you handling this kind of evidence that has, evaluations with questions that are different? that look at different types of interventions. So there's been a real, I think, learning and attention perhaps, and this is really, I think, what was most interesting for me, and what they said is this community can help us maybe answer some questions. So I want to come to you just humbly as not a member of the community and just be very open and transparent about that. And also picking up on something that, that Andy from AIR said yesterday around qualitative synthesis and quantitative evidence synthesis not really speaking to each other. And I think some of that perhaps comes into the tension around what we're trying to do with evaluation and evidence synthesis. So I just say that as a way of an introduction, and partly what I felt the need to do in my presentation, rather than getting into methodology when I'm not a methodologist and don't pretend to be, is really just taking the cues from the work that you've been doing. The Global Evidence Commission report, I think, was just fascinating. And, you know, we see ourselves as UN evaluators or even UN, generators of evidence in different places in this schema. We see ourselves as, hybrid decision makers at times, intermediaries, evidence intermediaries, various organizations and units have these functions in different UN agencies. And I think also recognizing some of what was said in that commission report, the original report, around the fact that member states and other parts of the UN system really rely on the evidence that we're producing, and that comes in a variety of forms. So I wanted to just briefly, because you may not be aware of the work that the UN Evaluation Group is doing in particular, wanted to just touch on that briefly. We are an independent and interagency professional network. We're not actually a formal network. We're a formal network, but we're a voluntary network. And it includes the evaluation units of all UN agencies, the specialized funds and programs and affiliated organizations. So as you saw from Shiv's slide, many UN organizations involved in the coalition, many more out there in the broader world. And the work that we're doing is really to strengthen and harmonize evaluation practices. So there's a focus really on the standards that are listed here. So there are norms and standards by which that govern our work and that we abide by. These are based on independence, so having an independent evaluation function that is separate from the programming that goes on in our agencies, that we have quality standards that lead to a higher degree of credibility, and that we're utilization focused first and foremost, which I know is of course the main aim of the work you're doing, is for evidence to be used. We have also standards that we follow and that are consistent throughout the UN Evaluation Group. Just briefly as well to mention how we define evaluations. And again, it's very much focused on the use of evidence, the creation of evidence, and doing so in a credible way. And then feeding that findings, recommendations, and conclusions and lessons into decision-making processes, be they within our organizations, within the context of a UN system structure, be they at a country level to national governments and so on. So there's really a very strong link to policymaking, which I know is very much the focus of the work that's being done by Campbell and others. There's also a very strong focus on both accountability and learning. We are responsible as evaluation offices to our executive boards, and so there's an accountability there for funding that's provided to our organizations to provide independent evidence. And we also have very much a learning mandate and focus on learning. And just, I wanted to provide a little bit of some details and data on the evaluation budgets that we are operating with, and what that percentage is of our overall United Nations agency expenditure. So when colleagues, previous speakers, Shiv, for example, has referred to the broad evidence base, the tens of thousands of evaluations that are being produced by UN agencies. These are of various different types. There are, of course, impact evaluations, but also thematic policy evaluations. And those policy evaluations are typically policies of the UN agencies, not external policies, just to be clear. Country program, project level, and even intervention and thematic evaluations. So you have a variety of types of evaluations, different approaches, and at different levels. So this is, becomes a challenge when we get into the synthesis space. Just mentioning too, also something from the commission report around use. And I also found this this resonated with me, so I wanted to refer to it. The different strategies for evidence use, I think, are very much in keeping with the work that we're doing in the UN and that we've been focusing on for many years. And I just wanted to use that as a precursor to sharing very quickly some of the different ways in which we've been identifying the use of evaluation evidence. So whether it's maximizing relevance to specific needs, synthesizing evaluation evidence, this is something that our organizations across the UN have been doing for many years. Tracking user uptake of evaluation knowledge, and also capturing user opinion. So really trying to find out from users if this evidence has been useful to them. Now turning to the coalition, I think that in fact a lot has been said by previous speakers, but so I don't want to repeat the fact that there's a massive volume of evidence in each pillar. The challenges, I think, in Shiv's very clear slide around the different types of evidence, be it impact, be it process and program evaluations, these require different approaches, different synthesis approaches. And this then becomes very complicated and often leaves us with an overview that's at a very high level where you cannot necessarily get nuances related to specific population groups when we're looking at a leave no one behind agenda and trying to reach the furthest behind first, which is the mandate and requirement for many of our agencies. It's difficult to get that granularity. And as was mentioned as well, some of the political challenges, I think when you decide to take advantage of, there's a flip side, two sides of the utility coin. When you decide that you want to have something ready for a high level political forum or a high level event at the UN level or another global event, then that conditions and has a strong influence on your timing and the extent to which you can produce all of the aspects of your work in the time required. And last point here around the engagement. I mean, the very different types of engagement but from bilateral donors. They're going to be looking for different types of evidence. They want to have different types of evidence favored in different ways in the report. So there are tensions there that we need to be aware of. And last slide, just around really the tagline being that we are working in the UN system to enhance and leverage the global evidence architecture, very much the second priority that was discussed in the session on the Commission report yesterday. We feel that there's a lot of richness to be built on, as others have said. Consideration of context, given our presence in the field throughout the world, a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, this awareness and sensitivity to political dynamics and responding to user demands, again, at different levels, given that we are present really deep field all the way up to high levels of the UN system. And so lastly, a convening power, and I think a connection as well to a range of data and evidence initiatives. So the UN is very much present and wants to be certainly more involved in this. Last word is we have a session this afternoon on some of the interagency synthesis work that we've been doing in the UN, and really welcome any of you to come to that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Deb, and apologies, my Freudian slip, evidence synthesis, not evaluation synthesis. And thank you for being so on time. Daniel, please, let's end up with you before we open it up to questions.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a real pleasure. So I'd like to provide the perspective of a development bank with a remit in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I like to frame it as a user broker perspective because of the nature of the work that we do and the relationships that we have with policymakers and evidence producers as well. So as has been already pointed out, lagging progress on SDGs is pushing us to do something different. And I think the development banking community is really moving in this direction of thinking not so much about how much money we are spending in each sector or approving and lending in each sector, but talking about the difference that spending has. And so it should be obvious, but it really isn't. In the development banking world, there is very much a culture of counting the money and not counting the impacts. And so that is actually changing significantly in recent times. And I think it's really important because of if if the community is talking about what difference we make, we actually are able to put the relevant questions on the table so that we can actually increase demand for the evidence that will help us implement programs better. So there are references about, the different uses of evidence for persuasion, instrumental or enlightenment. And I think that, oftentimes we're really focused on the instrumental use of evidence, but the other two are really important as well. And I think this is kind of where this conversation is going. So CAF has really taken this agenda forward, and I wanted to show you this initiative, which is called Impacto CAF. Impacto CAF, what it does is that it characterizes CAF's activities in different sectors. It describes what exactly it does in each sector, and then it looks for credible scientific evidence on the impact of projects that are similar to what CAF is doing, and then uses that to sort of create a narrative about what might the impact of CAF's action be. And this is, I think, really significant in terms of the way that we are presenting ourselves to the community. And CAF is not alone in this. As I said before, or I had in my previous slide, the presidents of the World Bank and IDB recently signed an agreement pushing exactly for this kind of shift in their focus. So I think MDBs are natural players in the global evidence landscape, and we are close partners of implementing agencies, governments, and so MDBs are in a position to broker trust between producers of evidence and users of evidence. And there's quite a bit of experience, of course, in policy, in project implementation, policy advice, support, also, of course, evaluation of different kinds. And there are significant continuing efforts in producing individual studies that feed and build the evidence base. Also, a lot of effort and investment in capacity building, which is very important. And there's been a lot of talk in recent days about the need to coordinate more in order to avoid duplication efforts. And just recently, one of the important banks launched an evidence portal on crime policy. So, and they also have another one on education. So this just sort of highlights that it's not only in production that we need to avoid duplication, but in other areas as well, related to evidence use. So of course, highlighting the impacts of what organizations are doing is important for persuasive reasons, but it also helps, as I said, ask the right questions and also help develop guidelines for developing more impactful projects and projects that we finance. So this is one thing that I wanted to mention, and the importance and the relevance of MDBs in this whole project. And it really explains why an organization like CAF is really committed to this agenda. And I also wanted to bring forward some thoughts about the user. So there are big challenges in placing the user at the forefront. So as you've seen, the questions that are being asked here are very broad. And so what academic in the right mind would say, I'm going to do a review on the prosperity pillar. So this is not a normal research project, and let alone producing the output in 8 months. So, but the question is here. So someone has to do it. We have to produce it, right? So we have to sort of grapple with these challenges when we come close to understanding what the needs of the policymaking world are. And these set of photos suggest that, there's a lot of heterogeneity across the types of politicians that we deal with. And so it's not only that the policymakers are different. We want to think about in each context what kinds of incentives they have for actually doing a good job. So, and this of course should imply higher demand for tools for doing a good job, and that in principle should be the evidence. But I also want to highlight another kind of user, which is the bureaucrat. Some of you might know this monument to the unknown bureaucrat in Iceland. It's I think it's a really nice description, celebration of the bureaucrats that keep the wheels of our societies turning. And it turns out that we have found in our evaluation work in Latin America that thinking about the bureaucrat is really, really important. And so we did a survey of over 2,000 public servants in 14 countries in the region. And we found that the public servants that were the younger public servants, highly trained, so with postgraduate degrees, and also with shorter tenures in their positions, were the most enthusiastic and the most excited about using evidence in their day-to-day work. So these are the natural allies for our work. And so thinking about what they need is also really important. What they want is actually really important. It turns out that what they're interested in is problems of implementation. Many times policy for these sort of mid-level professional, enthusiastic and naive bureaucrats, they're not making the policy decision. They're implementing something that someone else has told them to do. And so they are faced with implementation challenges. And that is really, if we can get information, get evidence on what works for implementing things that they already have to do, I think the uptake and the level of use would be much higher. So I just want to end with some thoughts on timing. So every discipline has a different definition of what a proper timeline is. And I think that, throughout the past few days, we've sort of agreed that timeliness is of the essence. And I just want to, like every policymaker I've spoken to ever, talks about the whirlwind it is. So circumstances change. And we also know that the evidence landscape changes. And so our ability to remain relevant and to actually make a difference is going to be very much tied to our ability to speed up our process. So I think it's an existential question, not just something that we wish for. Thank you.
Let's try swapping to this mic. So thanks very much to all of our panelists for sticking to time, made my job very much easier. We're going to open it up now. We've got about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Shiv is dashing through the slides to try and find the QR code for the coalition website in case you're interested. As we've been using over the last couple of days, I'd like to invite colleagues who are interested, who have a question, to come up to the mic. But let's just to get the ball rolling. We have one online from Kate Nyhan. I'm not sure where she's from, but she says, thanks, Kerry. For any panelist, but I'm going to hand it to Shiv to start with. Can you discuss the ideal size and composition of a team that's going to do, sorry, scrolling up, basically that's going to do a synthesis for SDGs? And she says that very often, I'm paraphrasing here, she says that very often people don't really know, or they start off their ambition and their delivery are a bit mismatched. You have to kind of, are there specific skill sets that you need for a SDG level sort of synthesis? And basically who should be in the team and what sort of skills do we need? So let me gather a couple because I can see already in the room. So that one's for Shiv. I'll start this side. John, do you want to start? Please, and yeah, sorry, please introduce yourself and say where you're from as well. I know.
Sure, John Levis from McMaster and the Evidence Commission. We're so grateful for allies like you in the UN system. I can't tell you how reassuring it is to know that we have champions like this. So 2 questions. One is for Shiv around timing, and we're 8 years into a 15-year agenda. Next year is the beginnings or the acceleration of a conversation about the post-SDG agenda. Should we be thinking instead of a platform for the global evidence architecture for that post-SDG agenda, and in the short run, focusing on kind of pilots that demonstrate proof of principle about how evidence synthesis can dramatically accelerate progress regardless of what the SDGs are focused on, but for now we'll use the SDGs as the use case. So it's really about your timeline. Should we have a parallel track about setting ourselves up for the next SDGs? Second question is, what advice would you have, all of you, for the evidence synthesis community about how we elevate the perceived value and the impacts of evidence synthesis in the UN system? You know, I can point to a number of recent examples that feel a bit demoralizing. The Quintet for Change, it amplifies the importance of data analytics, of evaluation, and there's a third one that it focuses on, behavioral and implementation research, silent on evidence synthesis. Another example that I wrote down was the Global Sustainable Development Report. Unbelievable opportunity to pull the evidence together to say, how do we accelerate? And instead it was what in health we call a GOBSAT process, good old boys sitting around the table. Almost no evidence syntheses. That should have generated the questions that could have accelerated the work of the Global Evidence Synthesis Coalition. And then some other examples. The first report that Andy and the team did, incredibly impressive, but impact evaluations extremely rare, very little evaluative thinking and voluntary national reviews. And then we often hear this point that $1 spent on synthesis is somehow $1 less spent on food for a starving child. But so much of what we do, certainly in my space, health, is harmful, it's ineffective, or it's inefficient. And evidence synthesis is such a small spend, and yet it can so dramatically accelerate the use of evidence in decision-making. So my question to you is, we've been saying this is helpful for so long. We know we need to move to showing we can do it on rapidly accelerated timelines. Can we use this opportunity with the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition to demonstrate these proof points? Tell us what the most pressing questions are, and then let the community mobilize around addressing them. So again, I want to emphasize the positive side. We're so grateful to all of you that we have allies. What can you give us in the way of guidance about how we can better demonstrate the extraordinary value of evidence synthesis in advisory and decision-making processes? Thanks.
One more question from here, and then we'll come to this side and we'll give the panel a chance to respond. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kerry. So I'm Patrick Okwen from eBase Africa in Cameroon. And I must say this session was really interesting, and it reminded me of the paper on experimenting society, which highlights the connections between the SDGs and evidence synthesis. I think this paper is done by Howard White. And the presentation actually highlights the relevance of the evidence revolution waves as described in the study. My curiosity is around the connections of what you are doing with the country offices, in particular, especially because the UN agencies can actually leverage a lot with the local governments in uptaking effective interventions, which is our experience in Cameroon, Niger, and Chad in the work that we are doing. This is one of the reasons why we have been working hard towards like really building capacities for evaluations for local evaluators, especially looking at what's going on in countries. But some challenges includes the definition of the intervention. So for example, UN Women is rolling out a program that we are currently evaluating on menstrual hygiene management. It took us a whole year to be able to develop a tidier document and convince UN Women that it's important to have a tidier document if you want to evaluate the intervention. If you have the intervention being rolled out by 5 different civil society organizations that are funded by UN Women in 5 different ways, you cannot evaluate that kind of intervention. And I think Deborah's experience on some questions and challenges that came up on the methods really, really speaks to this. When they start asking you, why should we do this? Why should we do it like this? This is when it's important to clarify why we need to have an intervention that can be described and that can be replicated. So my question is, do we have in place some strategies to ensure that country programs are designed and rolled out in a way that they can be more easily evaluated? And how can we promote local and indigenous evaluators leading on this? And then secondly, how do we mobilize the knowledge synthesized from the network, ensuring that no one is left behind? I believe that at the end of this synthesis that this great job that you are doing, it's going to be important that governments can be able to use it. Practitioners will be able to use it. People in their houses should be able to look at it and use it. Now, what strategies do we have in place? Those are some of the things that we could also come on board, contribute, and ensure that this works well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. If you guys want to sit down for a minute, just whilst I've noted you, and I'll come back to you two first. So panel, Shiv, do you want to start? There were the first couple of questions, both the one from Kate online about team composition, and then there was a particular one from John to you around timing issues.
Yeah. Okay, so there was a question about size and composition of a team undertaking these syntheses. It might be easier to talk about composition than size. I think Thomas's team, you had what, 14 people on your team, right? Is that right?
I think so, more or less.
Yeah, 14 people. So, I mean, and they were covering these 4 different sources of evidence. So they, on their team, they also had experts in areas that we might not usually find on a synthesis team in terms of the data science side. But I would say that a composition, I mean, obviously you need a team leader, you need probably people covering who have expertise in the quantitative synthesis side and the qualitative synthesis side, research assistants who are doing the actual work of searching and screening and extraction. I think it's important to have thematic expertise on the team there to inject that subject matter kind of expertise. I mean, it will come from the technical advisory panels, but it's good to have it on the team, and then, you know, the information management specialist as well. So, I mean, I would say those are the key skills that need to be covered. And I mean, the size of the team is kind of dependent on the scope, right? And I mean, maybe the partnership pillar experience is indicative, but you need a pretty large team to cover all the different aspects of the synthesis and the way we've defined them. On John's question on the timing, so to talk post-SDG politically at the moment in the UN system is tricky because there's so much emphasis on trying to achieve the SDGs. So as a coalition, we're not really allowed, or we're not, you know, we don't kind of stray into that area, I should say. The emphasis on is really on 2030 and how we can achieve that. But I think as we get further down the timeline, as I indicated on the slide, you know, we can maybe start kind of introducing that into the conversation. And rather than having a parallel stream in terms of, you know, what can we do right now for the 2030 agenda, and then, you know, in parallel to that, what may come after, I think we show, you know, show through what we do right now. I think whatever the framework is going to be, I don't think it's going to be too dissimilar in terms of, you know, the themes and topics covered. So there will be some alignment because the issues and the problems are the same. It's just how they're framed. So I would say, yeah, we show in terms of what we do. And as we go down the line, I think it's going to be more and more important to kind of feed that evidence in, into those discussions about what we can do now and what may come after. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Shiv. Deb, do you want to take one of John's other questions around what we can do to elevate use of synthesis across the UN system, and possibly also what we're doing to strengthen local evaluators, perhaps links to countries?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm not, I mean, it's a very, very challenging question. I would, just to provide a bit of a counterpoint to what Shiv said, I don't disagree that there's certainly still a huge focus on acceleration, but I think the words coming out of the UN system, certainly by you know, different agencies and even governments, is about rescuing the SDGs. So the minute they're talking about rescuing, there's a space there. I think that the channels, you've described many of them, but I think, there's this coalition, all of the challenges notwithstanding, has provided an opportunity and a space for relationships and relationship building and new connections in a way that I think you've identified it. And I think this meeting and the number of us here for the first time is a testament to that. I think there are, it seems, worlds, the scientific world, the research, quantitative research world, even the quantitative evaluation, sort of impact evaluation world is not speaking to the work that we do primarily, which is, a qualitative evaluation evidence. So there's big communities out there that can be brought together. The best way to do that, not quite sure. I don't know if Isabel's showed up yet, but she's now, oh, there she is. Hello. So I think someone in her position, or even Andrea Cook, if Andrea's in the room, who's the new executive director for system-wide evaluation. I mean, these are people in key positions that have a really excellent overview and that kind of social, capital as part of their work and networking and so on. Maybe just to also say that there's a big focus, and I kind of got trapped in it a little bit as I was preparing this presentation on data. And she's like, no, it's not the same thing as evidence, come on, 101 mistake. But there's a huge, just to say that there's a lot of effort and energy and time taken up with trying to do data portals, data coalitions, et cetera. So, I'm not sure how to deal with that. It's just an observation. I think there's comments that I just wanted to make around a lot of work is going on around national evaluation capacity development. There are many different coalitions and partnerships trying to connect, local talent. It speaks to your point, sir. Local evaluation capacities of evaluators themselves, but also of policymakers, of parliamentarians, of legislators. So there's a lot going on in that area that could be shared. And maybe the last point is that there is work within the UN system to develop a common country assessment and then a UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. These are often quite routine exercises, but I think there's huge pressure for them to be more meaningful, for them to be more evidence informed, and for national counterparts to be part of these in a very meaningful way, such that we as UN agencies are following what governments are prioritizing and not working not only in parallel, but off in a silo. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Deb. I'm looking at the clock and I want to get these two questions in. So maybe for Birte and Daniel, I'll ask you just to hold any thoughts that you have on those questions, and hopefully we'll come back to them in a sec. But please go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Peter Bragg from Monash University in Australia. Thank you for the presentation and for these efforts. There's been a few mentions of questions and question prioritization, and I'm wondering if you've given much thought to how you can assemble, deduplicate and prioritize questions as a way of perhaps unitizing and getting your head around this challenge. Just to give you one simple example, the question of how are we going on SDG 3, that's kind of a massive review of reviews, but have we moved the needle on halving road toll, the burden of road trauma by 2030 is a much more focused question. If we had a good idea about the types of questions that are being grappled with and the ways in which they are being prioritised, that could really help us as a review community get our heads around the scales and the units that we're working with. So I just wanted to know if you've got any reflections on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Fiona?
Fiona Campbell, Newcastle University, UK. Thank you. It's so exciting to see the need and the recognised need for evidence synthesis to support decision-making towards the SDGs. But I just wondered if you have any advice for those of us who are evidence synthesis methodologists about what you think are the priorities for innovations in evidence synthesis methodology that can best support you. You mentioned timeliness, but I'm also aware that many of the evaluations don't even reach threshold for what we would include in an evidence synthesis. So I wonder, what is it that we can learn? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's hold it there for now. So I'm going to open it up with either giving Daniel or Birte a chance to respond to that. So Peter's question around prioritizing questions, and particularly, are there clear evidence gaps? And he mentioned the example of road traffic, but there could be others. And then Fiona's question around where do we need to innovate in synthesis methodology? Daniel, you look like you're itching to go. Go ahead. Yeah.
So as part of the prosperity pillar management group, we've begun to have this conversation. The scope is massive. We are very much aware. And so how do we narrow it down to make it useful? To meet a deadline, an impossible deadline, by the way, but also to make whatever we produce useful. So I think that the kind of conversation that is going on right now is to say, well, let's try to think about a theoretical, conceptual framework that brings the pillar together. And let's try to identify like a mix between areas where the evidence base is rich or fairly populated, and the sort of key drivers of this framework. So I think for the prosperity pillar, one natural candidate is just as an example. I'm not saying that this is a done discussion at all, but maybe issues around productivity tie a lot of the issues there together. And so one way to think about it is to say, well, maybe what we can do is to propose a plan. Like maybe we could do within the timeline, we can think of a review of a set of narrowly defined questions that we know are central to the pillar. And then other things can, are left for an ongoing process, because this, as Shiv said, this basically, each of these reports, the way, at least that I view them, are not endpoints. They're actually starting points for getting the evidence around these issues in a organized and in a useful fashion. But it's just we are realistic about the impossibility of covering the whole thing in one go. So I think that's maybe at least from the prosperity pillar perspective, that's what I could share of the conversations that we've been having in the management group.
Thank you. Birte, do you want to answer the question around priorities for innovation and synthesis methodology?
Thank you. So I think a couple of key areas. I think that there isn't enough clarity and agreement around how we handle different types of studies. So you mentioned the issue of sort of where the studies are on the threshold, but it's a different threshold, right? They're completely different studies, so we need different criteria, both for inclusion, how we critically appraise, and for synthesis. And I know that there is a lot of work ongoing on this, including in Campbell. But I think that really, when you're doing projects at this time scale, you don't have time to spend 6 months to figure out your methodology. You really need to have a clear path to how to approach it. I think another area, probably not surprisingly, is in the area of machine learning and using AI, where we can do quite a lot when it comes to study identification. But I think when it comes to other tasks like data extraction, which is still takes a lot of resource, there is much less progress. And so I think obviously that is something that would help accelerate a project like this.
Thank you. We're almost at time. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about that. I want to give each of the panelists 30 seconds, very quick, key takeaway you want everybody in the room to hear. And I'd also like to put her on the spot, she doesn't know, to invite Isabelle Mercier, Director of Evaluation at UNDP, who's also the co-chair of this, in case there's a key takeaway she also wants to have. But panelists first. So Daniel, go ahead.
I thought it would go last, but thanks. So no, I think that, well, this is really important work. I think that the focus on the SDGs as a political issue globally really is a useful tool for what John was asking before. I think your question is $1 million question. We don't have I don't know. I mean, I was thinking, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think that the SDGs are really helping us focus attention. And I see it in every context that I'm working in, like with countries or with agencies because they're like, oh, what's happening with the SDGs? We have to code everything according to the SDGs. Now we have to measure progress in the SDGs. How is this project helping this country advance their SDGs? So there's a lot of focus. So we can. So I think it's a good moment to. This is a good opportunity to push this more general agenda forward. And I think that's the great value of this initiative.
Thank you. Quick.
I'll be
People
quick.
want their
No,
coffee, but Deb, go ahead.
just to say that I think the continuing the conversation between sort of evaluation and evidence synthesis worlds, continuing the conversation about the quantitative and qualitative approaches, continuing to communicate between communities and across communities would be my final takeaway. Thanks.
Thank you, Deb. Birte?
So I think this is a massive opportunity. I think it's important to not let the scale of the potential of this be paralyzing. And so if the approach needs to be piece by piece, then I think that's better than nothing.
Thank you. Shiv?
I'm going to take the liberty to go back to a couple of questions before I give my phrase. That's
30
okay.
seconds, you better
Okay.
be quick.
On the questions, I think we're open to kind of thinking about whether the questions should be more specific, whether in each pillar we should focus on specific things which might be accelerator points or points where there might be trade-offs. So I think that there's scope for us to think about being more specific on the questions which will ultimately give us better findings and more specific lessons. On the methodological innovations, because of the size and scope, we're kind of thinking, well, should these syntheses be some sort of hybrid of a review of reviews and then aligned with a review of individual process and performance evaluations? So that's really complex. I don't know if there's a precedent for that kind of thing. And that would be useful to start thinking about whether there's a good way forward on that. Thank you for allowing me to do that. My final remark is we have this saying in the Secretariat in UNDP, keep calm in coalition. So I'm going to leave you with that. Keep calm in coalition as we go forward.
Thank you, Shiv. And final word to my coalition co-chair, Isabel.
Hi everyone. I'll turn here because I think I'm talking to all of you. I'm new in this position. I just joined UNDP in August. But was actually in my previous role a very early supporter of coalition work in my role in the Government of Canada. And what appealed to me was this idea that we all too often look at what we're solely responsible for, which is a very small sliver of the pie in terms of advancing anything really. What's exciting to me about this coalition and about synthesis work in general is that it has the ability to look across systems. And I think that's where we really learn because, you know, if we have a much larger view, we could come up with some very profound insights. What excites me about this coalition too is that we have a direct pipeline to the people in this world who make big decisions about what gets spent, where, and how it's done. So I think there's a lot of value in us continuing a conversation about how we work together to make sure that this whole system of us working together is optimized and so that we can change the world and make it a better place.
Thank you very much, Isabel. With that, draw it to an end. Please take a look. It's not there anymore. Take a look at the coalition website, Global SDG Synthesis Coalition, and please come join us. And we'll be around to answer any questions or to hear anything more that you would like to know about the coalition over the next couple of days. Thanks very much.